The night Butterbean got next-level scary. They called him Butterbean, a nickname that sounded like something you'd hear at a county fair, harmless and almost affectionate, the kind of name that belongs to a mascot rather than a monster. There was nothing harmless about what happened once that bell rang. Inside the ropes, the man carried something closer to condensed violence than boxing skill, 350 pounds packed into a frame barely 5'10", moving with a speed that defied every assumption his size invited. Opponents built like athletes, trained like professionals, and carrying real records walked in believing they had a plan. Within seconds, most of them discovered that plans mean nothing against a right hand that arrives faster than the eye can track and lands with enough force to switch off consciousness before the brain even registers pain. This wasn't a man who outboxed people. He simply closed distance and ended arguments, and the tape of his career reads less like a series of matches and more like a study in how quickly certainty can collapse. George Clark found that out the hard way, showing up at 238 pounds with more bravery than sense, brave enough to sign the contract, but apparently not brave enough to read the fine print. Butterbean strolled out like a man late for lunch, and Clark became the appetizer. 2 knockdowns landed inside 2 minutes, Clark's legs essentially filing for divorce from the rest of his body, and by the time the fight ended for good, the crowd hadn't even finished processing what they'd witnessed. It was the kind of ending that leaves an arena standing in stunned silence for a full beat before the cheering even starts, because nobody in the building expected it to be over that fast. Pat Jackson tried something different, actually standing his ground and trading, becoming the rare man foolish enough to throw hands with what felt less like a boxer and more like a human vending machine dispensing pain on command. Jackson lasted longer than most, made it deep into the rounds, bled a little, survived a referee who got clipped mid-fight, and hit the canvas himself in one of the stranger moments of the night. Bean walked him down like a repo man working through his list, using the ropes as Jackson's only real ally in the fight, and still it wasn't enough. His corner threw in the towel before the 4th round even started, sparing him from finding out what came next, though fate apparently wasn't finished, since Jackson still managed to walk into the best punch of the entire fight after it had technically already ended. Then there was Lewis, the facelifter Monaco, a bodybuilder with the kind of physique that looks unstoppable in a magazine spread and means absolutely nothing once real punches start landing. 3 seconds after the bell, Monaco was on the canvas, and the referee didn't even bother finishing the count. William Harris came in as a journeyman hunting for the win of his career. The public record generally identifies Meghan Markle as being born in 1981. The alternative theories have circulated for years, but the material presented in those theories contains its own contradictions. One of the most frequently cited examples involves Samantha Markle. The original argument claims that Samantha's age difference with Meghan establishes a particular birth year, but the transcript itself acknowledges that the age gap has sometimes been rounded. That may seem insignificant, but when an entire theory depends on calculating someone's birth year from an age difference, even a small variation can change the result. Then there is Meghan's own writing. A private email that later became part of legal proceedings has been discussed in connection with the ages of her siblings at the time her parents separated. The wording has been interpreted as confusing the ages of Samantha and her brother. Again, that is an inconsistency, but it is not necessarily proof that Meghan's own birth year is false. People misremember ages. People make mistakes. People describe events differently years later. And legal documents can contain errors without invalidating every other fact within them. That is why responsible documentary storytelling has to resist the temptation to turn every inconsistency into a revelation. The more interesting story is actually the uncertainty itself. How did a question about one date become a decades-long argument? Why do people continue returning to the same pieces of evidence? And why does the controversy remain emotionally powerful even when the evidence is mixed? Those are the questions worth exploring, because behind the birthday candles is something larger. It is the extraordinary relationship between celebrity, memory, documentation, and public trust. Meghan Markle is not simply a private individual whose birth date is being discussed by a handful of people. She became one of the most scrutinized women in the world. Every aspect of her biography has been examined. And once public trust becomes divided, even ordinary facts can become battlegrounds. One side sees documentation and says the matter is settled. The other sees inconsistencies and says the documentation deserves further examination. Somewhere between those positions is the responsibility of anyone telling the story, to separate what is documented from what is alleged, to distinguish a discrepancy from proof, and to recognize when the evidence simply does not allow a definitive conclusion. That distinction will become even more important as we examine the timeline of Meghan's parents, because that is where one of the biggest problems with the alternative birth year theories begins. If Meghan had actually been born in 1976 or 1977, the question would not stop with Meghan. It would move backward. It would force us to reconsider when Thomas Markle and Doria Ragland first met, when they married, and when their daughter could realistically have been born. And that timeline creates a problem for the alternative theory that is difficult to ignore. According to the account presented in the source material, Thomas and Doria met around 1979. They married later that same year. Their daughter was then born in 1981. That sequence is broadly coherent. But if Meghan had instead been born in 1976, she would have arrived years before the relationship that supposedly led to her birth. That is not a minor discrepancy. It would require a completely different family history. And if the proposed alternative date were correct, then the question would no longer be simply about Meghan's age. It would be about the entire chronology of her parents' lives. That is where this story takes an unexpected turn, because sometimes the strongest way to test a theory is not to look at the person accused of lying. It is to look at the people and events surrounding them. And when you do that, the alternative timeline begins to face some very serious questions. But there is still one piece of the story we haven't examined closely enough: the evidence surrounding Meghan's own statements about age. Years before she married Prince Harry, Meghan spoke publicly about the way age can affect women working in the entertainment industry. She described the pressure women can face and explained why actresses may sometimes be encouraged not to reveal their age. Yet she also publicly identified herself as 33 at the time. That statement is significant, not because it proves everything, but because it gives us a contemporaneous statement from Meghan herself. And that brings us to the central question. If the public record, family chronology, and Meghan's own statements generally point toward 1981, what explains the conflicting material? Is there actually a hidden story? Or have years of internet speculation transformed ordinary inconsistencies into something much larger? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning, not to the birthday, not to Prince Harry, not to the royal family, but to Meghan Markle's childhood and the timeline of the people who were there before she ever became famous. Because before there was a duchess, there was a family. And before there was a controversy, there was a date. The question is whether that date was ever truly as mysterious as the internet made it seem. There is a reason the timeline matters. Because when people argue about Meghan Markle's age, they often begin with a number and work backward. But history works in the opposite direction. You begin with what happened, then you ask whether the dates fit. And when we apply that method to Meghan's family, the picture becomes considerably more complicated. The alternative theories generally point toward the mid-1970s. Some versions suggest 1976. Others suggest 1977. There have even been claims involving still earlier dates. But every time the proposed birth year moves backward, another problem appears. Meghan's parents, their relationship, their marriage, and the circumstances surrounding her birth. According to the timeline presented in the source material, Doria Ragland was born in 1956. Thomas Markle was older. The two eventually met while working in the television industry in Los Angeles. Their relationship developed quickly, and in December 1979, they married. That date is important because it gives us an anchor. If Meghan was born in August 1981, then the timeline is straightforward. Her parents met. They began a relationship. They married. And approximately 19 months later, their daughter was born. Nothing about that sequence automatically raises an obvious chronological problem. But now change the birth year. Suppose, for the sake of testing the theory, that Meghan had actually been born in 1976. That would place her birth approximately 3 years before her parents' reported marriage. And depending on which version of their meeting is accepted, it could place her birth before they had even met. That creates a much bigger problem than a disputed magazine caption. It would require a completely different explanation for the family's history. And that is something the alternative theories rarely explain in a coherent way. They focus intensely on individual pieces of evidence. A photograph, a magazine page, an old statement, a school record, an alleged age discrepancy. But the entire timeline has to work together. If one theory requires multiple independent events to be moved several years backward, then the burden of proof becomes much higher. This is where documentary research becomes useful. Instead of asking, "Which number do I believe?" ask, "Which timeline explains the greatest number of independently documented events with the fewest contradictions?" That question changes everything, because the publicly reported 1981 timeline has one major advantage. It fits the known sequence of Meghan's parents' marriage and her birth. The alternative timeline has to explain why Meghan would appear in the family story before her parents' relationship supposedly began. And that is not an easy problem to solve. But there is another piece of evidence that has repeatedly been pulled into the debate. Doria Ragland's school years. Photographs from her youth have circulated for years, including images associated with Fairfax High School. The photographs themselves are not proof of Meghan's birth date, but they help establish Doria's own chronology. And that chronology matters because Doria's age at the time of Meghan's birth can be calculated from the publicly reported dates. If Doria was born in September 1956, then on August 4, 1981, she would have been 24. She would turn 25 less than a month later. That is a completely plausible age for a first-time mother. More importantly, it fits the broader family timeline. There is no chronological impossibility there. In fact, the official account becomes relatively ordinary when viewed this way. A young woman grows up in Los Angeles. She attends school. She becomes an adult. She works. She meets a man in the television industry. They marry. And less than 2 years later, they have a daughter. There is no hidden mathematical mystery in that sequence. But the internet rarely rewards ordinary explanations. It rewards mysteries. And Meghan's life has produced plenty of material for them. Her relationship with her parents has been complicated and highly publicized. Thomas Markle became a recurring figure in the media after Meghan's relationship with Harry became public. His interviews generated headlines. His disagreements with Meghan became international news. And his public descriptions of Meghan's childhood have sometimes differed from the way Meghan herself has described those years. That difference has become fuel for further speculation. For example, Thomas has described Meghan as spending substantial periods of her childhood living with him. Meghan has also spoken about her relationship with her mother and the distance between them. During certain periods, those accounts have been interpreted by commentators as evidence of something more sinister. But again, interpretation is not the same thing as proof. Families can remember the same period differently. Parents can emphasize different parts of a child's upbringing. Children can experience the same household in a completely different way from the adults around them. And divorce can complicate everything. So the existence of conflicting memories does not automatically establish that Meghan's identity or birth history was fabricated. It simply tells us that the family story is complicated. And complicated stories are particularly vulnerable to selective interpretation. Now consider what happens when a celebrity's childhood is examined decades later. A photograph from the 1970s suddenly becomes important. An old yearbook becomes evidence. A forgotten interview becomes a clue. A relative statement from years earlier is pulled back into the conversation. Then social media users begin comparing faces. They compare hairstyles. They compare school years. They compare photographs of people who may have been different ages. And eventually, an entire alternative biography can emerge. But there is a fundamental problem. Human beings are terrible at estimating age from photographs, especially when the photographs come from different decades. Hair changes. Fashion changes. Photography changes. People mature at different rates. And lighting can make someone look dramatically older or younger. So photographs can provide context. They rarely establish a precise birth date by themselves. That is why the old 17 material remains so controversial. If a publication genuinely identified Meghan Markle as 21 in 1997, that would deserve serious examination. But the key question remains whether the page has been correctly identified and correctly interpreted. Without establishing that, the calculation remains speculative. And there is another important point. Even if an old publication contained an incorrect age, that would not automatically prove that Meghan herself deliberately supplied false information. Magazine errors happen. Profiles can contain mistakes. Information can be supplied by someone other than the person being profiled. And sometimes a publication simply gets something wrong. That is why responsible reporting requires more than showing an image and asking viewers to draw the most dramatic conclusion. It requires verification. Who created the document? When? From what source? Was the person interviewed? Was the information independently confirmed? Was there ever a correction? Those questions are far more useful than simply asking whether the document looks suspicious. Now, there is another element of the story that deserves attention. Meghan's own comments about age. Before her marriage to Prince Harry, Meghan was already an established actress. She had worked in an industry where age can influence casting. She discussed that reality publicly. The source material points to an interview from 2015, when Meghan identified herself as 33. That statement matters because it came years before she became one of the world's most controversial royal figures. At that point, she had little reason to anticipate the extraordinary level of scrutiny that would later surround her personal life. And the arithmetic is straightforward. If Meghan was 33 in 2015, that points toward a 1981 birth year. That is consistent with the publicly reported date. It does not prove every detail of her biography, but it is another piece of contemporaneous evidence pointing in the same direction. This is where the alternative theory begins to lose some of its force. Because if Meghan were actually born in 1976, she would have been approximately 39 in 2015. That would make her statement dramatically different from the public record. Yet the interview is not presented as someone accidentally revealing an older age. It is presented as Meghan openly discussing the subject. So the question becomes, why would someone who allegedly intended to conceal her age voluntarily identify herself as 33? There may be explanations. A person could lie. A publication could report incorrectly. A person could have been using a professional age. Or the alternative theory could simply be wrong. The evidence available in this transcript does not establish which explanation is correct. And that distinction is essential. A documentary should not pretend certainty where the evidence does not provide it. The strongest conclusion we can draw from this section is narrower. There are competing claims. Some pieces of material appear inconsistent, but the alternative birth year theories face serious chronological difficulties. And Meghan's own 2015 statement is broadly consistent with the publicly reported 1981 date. That does not end the debate, but it changes the question. Instead of asking, what if Meghan was born in 1976? We should ask, what evidence would be necessary to demonstrate that she was? And that brings us back to records, because the entire controversy ultimately depends on the hierarchy of evidence. A photograph is evidence of a moment. A magazine is evidence of what a publication printed. A family statement is evidence of what a relative said. A legal filing is evidence of what someone represented in court. But a birth record is specifically intended to document a birth. That makes it fundamentally different. The source material acknowledges the existence of an official state record supporting the 1981 date. That fact cannot simply be removed from the story because other material is more dramatic. If someone wants to overturn that record, they need evidence stronger than speculation. They would need to demonstrate that the record itself is fraudulent, erroneous, or associated with a different person. That is an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is also where some of the more extreme theories begin to appear. Among them is the suggestion that Meghan may have been adopted or that her parents somehow. During certain periods, those accounts have been interpreted by commentators as evidence of something more sinister. But again, interpretation is not the same thing as proof. Families can remember the same period differently. Parents can emphasize different parts of a child's upbringing. Children can experience the same household in a completely different way from the adults around them. And divorce can complicate everything. So the existence of conflicting memories does not automatically establish that Meghan's identity or birth history was fabricated. It simply tells us that the family story is complicated. And complicated